Graag uw aandacht voor een van onze all-time favorites. Gekochte journalisten. De auteur Udo Ulfkotte werkte jarenlang bij een van Duitslands grootste kranten, de Frankfurter Allgemeine. Hij kwam daar in aanraking met praktijken die het daglicht niet kunnen verdragen. Journalisten bleken zonder probleem voor geheime diensten te werken, lieten zich vetteren met lange snoepreizen naar Amerika en lieten vergaande invloed van overheden toe in hun schrijfwerk en waarover ze wel en niet schreven. Hij kreeg spijt van zijn werk, nam ontslag en schreef Gekochte journalisten. Dit boek stond 3 jaar lang achter elkaar in de top 10 van Duitsland, tot groot ongenoegen van het hele media, boeken- en bladenkartel en de geheime diensten. Een paar jaar geleden overleed Ulfkotte aan de gevolgen van zijn werk. Veel te jong en zo belangrijk geweest voor de ontmaskering van de mainstream media. Kijk voor meer informatie op www.deblauwetijger.com/winkel. Dank u wel.
Hartelijk welkom bij deze speciale uitzending vanuit de Blauwe Tijger Studio in Groningen. En vandaag een interview met professor David Engels, klassicus, hoogleraar te Warschau en schrijver van het boek dat deze week verschijnt bij uitgeverij De Blauwe Tijger, Op weg naar het imperium. De crisis van Europa en de ondergang van de Romeinse Republiek. Een bijzonder boek en ja, ook om misverstanden te voorkomen, het is geen boek over de ondergang van het Romeinse Rijk, zoals je wellicht zou denken, maar het gaat om de overgang van het Romeinse Rijk als republiek naar de dictatuur, de fase van de heerschappij van de keizers. En dat is eigenlijk de fase die David Engels vergelijkt met de huidige crisis van de Europese Unie. Professor Engels is een Duitsstalige Belg, spreekt geen Nederlands, wel Frans en Duits en Engels. En we zullen het interview dan ook in het Engels houden. Very welcome to our show, Professor Engels.
Hello, good evening.
And my first question would be, can you give us an impression of what your idea is of this crisis of the European Union?
For me, the crisis of the European Union is not only a passing crisis with economic or institutional roots, it's an identity crisis. And it's a crisis that is not only rooted in one or the other aspect of its manifold history, it's a crisis that has been in the making for decades, more or less, which has been in some way also been inevitable, which is a systemic crisis, which is preordained in some way already during the foundation of the European community. And today we are reaping the fruits of our many errors of the past. So it's a crisis that is inevitable.
Yeah, that's your thesis, but many of our viewers will think, well, we are an affluent society. We have all kinds of democratic procedures. There's not much to complain about living in the European Union.
Yes, it's sure that comparing, for example, the present state of life, of mind in the European Union with people living somewhere, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, is certainly very much to the advantage of the European Union. But behind this facade of an apparent peace and freedom, we see very many elements which seem to be very problematic and which make also understandable why I compare it with the last decades of the Roman Republic before this republic then crumbled into civil war and, as you said, into an authoritarian state. For example, if we look at the high unemployment rate, if we look at the state debts, if we look at the fall of the traditional family, if we look at the decline of religion, if we look at the manifold problems created by globalization, if we look at the rising of technocracy everywhere, if we look also at the growing disagreement of the citizens with this former state, if you look at the problem of immigration, all this is very similar to the late Republic.
Yeah, let's focus on the sentiment among citizens. Lately we have seen a lot of protests here in the Netherlands, also in Germany. We can think of the yellow vests, the gilets jaunes in France, etc. Do you consider these phenomena as symptoms of this crisis? And what exactly do these protests have in common?
Yeah, exactly. When I wrote my book in the French version in 2013, and it was published in 2013, so I wrote it in 2012, many people said to me that I'm much too pessimistic, that all these fear about its violent transition into a decade-long period of civil wars was much too pessimistic and not really credible.
You're talking about a transition to a civil war, you say?
Yes.
Can you explain it? You are expecting some kind of civil war in Europe or in parts of Europe?
Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily civil war in the sense of what we had, for example, in the Roman Republic with armies fighting each other in a more or less organized way. I see rather the risk of seeing our present state or way of life slowly crumbling into some form of unrest, which is dominated, for example, by suburbs of cities, more or less not dominated anymore by police or by the state.
The no-go zones.
No-go zones, for example, by clans.
So in your theory, you could see these protests as some kind of birth pangs of such a revolution. This could lead to a more general state of social unrest, also in all kinds of violent manifestations.
I think that is one of the first symptoms of something that will be much more generalized in the next years. Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
The central thesis of your book is that it is enlightening and important to see certain parallels, analogies with a certain phase in the history of the Roman Republic. Can you explain to us and to our viewers on which epoch in the Roman history do you focus especially?
I would focus essentially on the first half of the first century, more or less, or at least in the period between the demise of Sulla and then the beginning of the civil wars, starting with the wars between Caesar and Pompey. So that's more or less the mid first century, when on the one hand we were beyond the phase of a violent opposition between the more conservative and the more socialist factions, as represented by Marius and Sulla, and which resemble very much what we had with communism.
Who are Marius and Sulla?
Exactly. As I said, they are two politicians heading each one a faction which we could, in a very simplified way, put in analogy with the more socialist and the more fascist approach of history, a bit like what we had in Europe in the 30s, 40s, with Franco even much later. Then a period of relative peace and prosperity, where many symptoms behind this facade were showing that everything was not really fine. That is more or less what we are living today. And then from 49 onwards, or even earlier, we see that this peace was only an uneasy truth, that civil war will emerge. That's more or less.
And how would you characterize that period before the first century, the time of the Republic? What was the value of that culture?
Well, the Republic, of course, evolved for half a millennia, so it's very difficult to synthesize that. But I would say that one of the main ideas was a certain civic participation in public, public administration, some form of perhaps egalitarian approach, but essentially a deep rooting of this Republic in the customs and traditions of the forefathers, what is called the mos maiorum. And that is what the Romans lost more and more, as they said in their own time, and this seems also to be what we are losing more and more also. The link to our own history.
Yes, and the link to our own history also has to do with the global expansion of the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic. Do you see a certain analogy with what we call today globalization?
Exactly. Romanization is the same form as globalization. Today we call it globalization. Now it is much more an Americanization of the world. In antiquity we had Hellenization, and one form of Hellenization, that is Romanization, that also brought with it this form of cultural homogeneization of the Mediterranean space.
Yeah, I want to focus on two aspects of this transition and the analogy you see between the Roman history and European contemporary history. The first is what you mentioned, civil participation. This development towards empire, this Romanization, it made it hard for citizens to participate in in politics, or what changed?
Well, it is very complicated to say, but on the one hand, we have that these enormous riches built by the expansion of the empire, essentially riches,
yes,
flew into the pockets, of course, of the senatorial and equestrian elites. So there is some form of elite forming that is losing more and more the contact with the population. Something, of course, which is reproached today to our.
And you can show that in the sources that complaints about elitism and the corrupt elite already were current in the Roman
absolutely.
times. Yes,
that's really common from the 3rd century already on it, but essentially from the 2nd century, where people are complaining that certain magistratures are only in the hand of families for generations and generations. A trend we are knowing also today. That is on the one hand, but on the other hand, we also see that this globalization of the Mediterranean or of the Roman Empire brought with it also some form of loss of identity, which then also affected this feeling of belonging of the citizens to this form of state, the deconnection with the past, and thus a bigger propensity also to simply vote for someone who proposed or promised golden mountains for tomorrow without any responsibility for their children or the next generation.
Okay, loss of identity. As I understand you, in the old days of the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, I must say, there was a feeling of citizenship that also was connected with the city of Rome, with the land of Italy, and that was more or less given. And after the expansion of the Republic, this identification with a motherland or a fatherland, patria, became more complex, or how did that work?
Exactly, that is one of one side. The other side is also a ever bigger migration threat, because the city of Rome itself became also the focus of a large interest of people from the periphery to move to Rome.
What's the periphery?
Also. The periphery of the Roman Empire, so we could speak, for example, about the south of Gaul, about Spain, Syria, of course, Asia Minor, so the Oriental territories.
Turkey, Middle East.
What is today Turkey, Middle East. And many of these people were, of course, very attracted also by the social assistance proposed by the Roman Empire, went to Rome, exactly. Many, of course, were also slaves that were liberated, became Roman citizens, and then also lived in Rome. So in some decades, this town of Rome changed completely its outlook and became a very
multicultural cosmopolitan.
Exactly,
society.
and people in this time
and
were
the much criticized xenophobia of our days, was that also a phenomenon of this phase of Roman history?
Yes, absolutely. We see in our sources that there have been, even in the 1st century BC, a series of proposals of ejecting all strangers from Rome, except those from Italy, but all the rest, to sending them back to their home countries, because they were putting into danger the identity of the city of Rome and the civic cohesion also. So we have this in our sources, and we see also a presence of xenophobic feelings until very far into the empire.
And they built a wall.
And they built a wall in some way. Yeah, of course. That's, of course, a later phase, but it's the same dynamics of inside and outside of an aging society also, that is not anymore able to expand, but that also wants to protect itself behind fixed borders. So it's also not only a sign of strength, but rather of weakness.
Yeah. The other aspect that fascinated me about your book was this aspect of what we would call these days secularization. So the loss of continuity in a religious perspective. How did that work in the end phase of the Roman Republic?
That is perhaps one of the most striking features, that today's loss of Christian identity is parallelized also by the decline of the Roman state religion. Of course, some of these outer forms were still conserved, but our sources are full of complaints that the old manners are not respected anymore, that temples are crumbling, that nobody cares anymore about prodigies or prophecies, that nobody wants to become priest, of course, that they did not even know the signification of certain gods from whom they only remembered the names but not anymore the functions. But on the other hand, we not only see this decline of allegiance to traditional forms of religion, but even more the interest in esoteric or exotic forms of religion.
Yeah, the cults, Hellenistic cults, Persian cults. Yeah.
Exactly, be it Isis and Osiris, Magna Mater, all these cults, Bacchanalia, found also great interest in Rome and resemble, of course, also to the esoteric boom we have today, and also the presence, of course, of many people from foreign cultures bringing their own religions now to the heart of Europe.
Okay, we have discussed some of these parallels. I can't strike this enough. You're not telling the standard theory of Gibbon, for example, that the Roman Empire fell as a consequence of decadence and decay. You're focusing on this earlier period of the end of the Republic and the transition to a dictatorship or an empire. That's how do you see that transition happening in our present-day European culture? What can we expect in that perspective? Because I do not see a Napoleon or a Caesar emerging right now. How long must we wait before such a dictator scenario becomes plausible?
Yeah, well, I would say in the 1790s, nobody would also have expected the advent of Napoleon and an empire. So it can go sometimes very quickly. And as Hegel once said, if the historical necessity is there, the man who will fill them appears automatically. So it's less a question of person than rather of historical constellations.
The conditions are there.
Exactly. It's difficult to say how such a crisis could look in Europe. But as I said, we will on the one hand we will have civic insecurity in the centers. We will have a rise of terrorism. We will have a paralyzed political system. We will have an ever bigger, greater economic polarization.
You're going way too fast. A paralyzed political system.
Yeah.
I can see that. There's a lot of discontent with current political practices. In what sense are our political mechanisms paralyzed, our political procedures? There's a certain stagnation you seem to imply. Can you explain that?
Yes, absolutely. Our system has long been characterized by the difference between left and right. And now we see that also under the pressure of the so-called populist or extremist parties, these middle parties in some way fusion more and more, have the same agenda, the same politics, but are unable, of course, to push them forward either in a typically left or typically right sense. And so there is a growing stagnation, as we have the impression that nothing is advancing, that we have to form so many compromises that in fact we are unable to react quickly also to outer threats. And on the other hand, there's also the problem that our democratic system, exactly as in the late Roman Republic, has become so complex, so intricated, that it is nearly impossible to put forward any serious long-term reform. That was also the end of the Roman Republic, and it will be our own end too.
Yeah. To translate it to, in terms of my own experience, you mean the idea that voters have the idea, it doesn't matter on which party I vote, political processes have their own dynamics and they go their own way.
Yeah.
Brussels is far away. Even The Hague is far away for most of the, but Brussels is even at a greater distance. Is that what you mean? That people don't have the experience that they are part of this political process?
That is certainly one of the aspects, but the other, which is perhaps even more important, is that our system has been created for a prolonged period of peace, for the 1950s, 1960s, when the Cold War and also the presence of the American troops made more or less any political decision the right one. I mean, when you had to rebuild Europe again, you couldn't take any wrong economic decision, and politically there wasn't any foreign policy because there was Cold War anywhere. Today, of course, this system, which has been created for peace, has to work in a much more complex situation. The rise of China, the demography crisis, the immigration, disinterest of the US, and so on, Islamization. And so we see that there is no reactivity within this system, which is much too complex. And that was
it's even too complex for national governments to
exactly for the European Union
respond
too.
Yes.
And that was also the problem in the late Roman Empire, late Roman Republic, where too people like Cicero also complained about the fact that these institutions could not react quickly enough.
Okay. Well, I find your sketch of Europe against the background of the Roman Republic very convincing and a bit unsettling. One of the statistics that you offer in the book is a poll about the need for a strong leader, the strong man, so to say. And when asked, the public response in the Netherlands, for example, I believe 43%, well, some kind of dictatorial compromise wouldn't be so bad. Can you elaborate on these statistics? Do you find that unsettling too?
Yes, of course, but not unexpected, because that is what we had to expect on the basis of these analogies, that we would have a similar evolution, that is period of unrest, and then more or less the fact that everyone agrees to some form of mild dictatorship, and be it only in order to create, again, order, peace, harmony. And
are you saying that the European public is more or less fed up with democracy? It's too complex, it's not effective, why don't we install a strong leader?
It's already starting, but I suppose that in 10, 15 years it will be much worse. But
how is it starting? Where is it starting?
Well, for example, the polls you quoted show that even in countries such as the Netherlands, which are economically quite sound, there is this kind of, I would say, in French you say désamour, so this lack finally of agreement or of love for democracy. But you can be sure that once the future economic crisis will set in, and we see it already in Greece, for example, or in Italy, this impression that this crisis is even due to democracy, and that democracy should change in order to set up again a functioning state, that this will certainly set in.
It comes from, it's not only the public that has this desire for a mild dictatorship, but you also write extensively on the situation in Greece during the crisis, in which there is a period that the country is practically governed by a troika and some experts from the European Bank and the World Bank and from Brussels. That's, in a way, it's very unsettling that European officials or financial authorities can intervene so radically in democratic processes. Would you consider the situation in Greece during the economic crisis that could be a possible scenario? How this would play out?
Well, it's already happening now. Greece is not the only example. I mean, there it was most obvious because there has been this troika, but all the other European states also know more or less what is expected of them, and if they contravene to what is expected of them, then they have to face the consequences. Think, for example, about the Visegrad states, who try to do something quite different from what is expected from them by Brussels, and who are experiencing a lot of very disagreeable consequences.
So then you would say it's inherent in this process of European unification that national sovereignty cannot be sustained, at least not in a democratic matter as we are, in a democratic way, like we are used to since the end of the Second World War. That's over.
In some way, it is inevitable. I mean, it was already inevitable at the end of the 19th century. It showed already that these economies were much too intertwined in order to function very separately. But at that moment, we only had a dozen of big states. In Europe now, we are more than 30, and it is quite clear that this system is so, as I said, interconnected that crises everywhere at the periphery also affect the center. So the reaction to that is the same as in the European, as in the Roman Republic. That is more and more control over the periphery from the center in order to stabilize everything.
Yeah.
It's inevitable in some way, but it's the end of national democracy as we knew it.
But in this time, we also see the development in the United Kingdom, the possibility of a Brexit. So it seems that there is a way out. Countries can decide to choose their own destiny. And more political leaders promise this possibility of an exit. You don't have to worry. When we take back control, we will leave the European Union. Do you find that a credible solution?
Well, you already said the possibility of a Brexit. So I'm not really sure about this Brexit. From the beginning on, I'm doubting very much about its real existence or its realization, so I'm not yet sure it will really happen, and even if it will happen, I'm also quite convinced that it will happen in a way that is not necessarily what the people expected from the beginning on. And already the many problems leading up to this phase show how difficult it is to leave this European Union and what consequences are there also to
Okay, but the
faced.
United Kingdom is a large country, large economy. Let's take the Netherlands, since we are here now. There are politicians who promise this perspective of an exit, that the Dutch can leave the European Union. Is that a credible way to go?
It is an illusion. I can understand why people are advocating this, and I have even some sympathies with this because I'm also very critical of what the European Union has become. Now I'm very much in favor of a European integration under other circumstances, but I think that leaving the European Union is even an impossibility. So this is simply unrealistic. We already see the consequences with the Brexit, and we have also to say that within the situation of world powers as they are today, in contrast to China, for example, Europe in one way or the other has to cooperate and has to form some form of European integration.
So you think the future of the Netherlands and other European countries will be in the European Union?
I'm not sure if it will be in the European Union as we know it today. I think that this union will more and more be paralyzed by the events to come, that it will be unable to cope with the period of unrest that I'm predicting more or less on the basis of the Roman Republic. And what will come afterwards? That will be, of course, a big mystery. Will the European Union be reformed from the interior by a strong man taking power? Will it first crumble and be reformed perhaps around some core states? That's difficult to say. But on the outset of this form of unrest, I see again a more or less unified Europe.
In your book, you point to one of the core problems of the European Union, and that's the impossibility to provide citizens with a sense of a shared identity. It's even worse. The only possible identity that the European Union provides is the identity of mankind, or universal values, universal human rights, etc. So this would be the first empire or union, political union, that claims to defend and to embody universal values and humanity as such. Or is that a...
No, not necessarily. I mean, that was already one of the tricks also of the Roman Republic, and essentially also the Roman Empire, to present itself as a universal state, embodying everything that is important of humanity. But before the advent of Augustus, this was done as today in a very, very universalist, very rationalist, very philosophical way that lost the citizen somewhere in between. Augustus managed to combine this attempt of representing civilized humanity with the fact that this civilized humanity was to be led or dominated at least by the spirit, by the traditions of the Rome as it was in the past. He restored to some way this Roman identity, and I think that is what might be happen also in our future.
But as it is now, okay, maybe I was wrong to say that the European Union was the first empire to claim universality. In a sense, the Soviet Union did the same thing.
China in antiquity already also.
Okay, yeah.
For example.
But as I understand you, right, then you say this European Union will not easily be transformed by itself. It has to go through a certain crisis before the necessity of a different kind of European Union will become possible. Why is that so? Why there can be a shift in balance, in political outlooks, which will start a process of reforming the European Union. Dozens of political parties argue for it.
Yeah.
Why is that so implausible?
That would be, of course, also my dream, a possibility of an inner reform without this period of unrest, and that is the content also of the
renovation of Europe.
I published recently, Renovatio Europae. Why, with a number of European intellectuals, we tried to put forward how such a reform, an inner reform project, could look like. But we also had no illusions. We also thought that our project was rather a political utopia, perhaps paving the way to a new understanding of Europe during this period of unrest and of reformation afterwards, because we are convinced that the system of the European Union as it is now, that is composed by so many institutions, states and so on, would need such a complete change of mind, not only within the bureaucracy, but also in most nation states, that it is more or less illusory to wait for this.
Okay,
I mean, so look, for example, already at the US, where you have with Donald Trump someone who is fundamentally opposed to most of his own administration and who in some way cannot put forward also his reform agenda because he has not the institutions for him. So that is one example why it would be so difficult.
There's a certain inner logic towards a mild dictatorship. Okay, then in the end of the book, you become a bit more speculative, of course. You're imagining a future. What would such a mild dictatorship look like? And the strange thing is, if I was to extrapolate current developments, I would say, well, Europe will become more liberal, more materialistic, more hedonistic, more diverse. Less and less will remain of traditional family structures, etc. But you paint a different picture. What's your idea of this Europe to come and this soft dictatorship, this moderate dictatorship?
I think that the ideals of liberalism are currently leading itself, as I said, ad absurdum, in a nearly Hegelian dialectical process. So today we are living in some form of antithesis of the traditional society. There will be afterwards some form of synthesis uniting both.
What's the antithesis?
Our
state versus
our
empire?
current society. No, I would say that the thesis in some way has been traditionalist European society. We are living now on the top of the antithesis to that, and we can expect some form of synthesis after, of course, a period of transition. One of the factors, of course, of the return to a more traditionalist society will also be the place of Islam within our society. That's, of course, one of the big differences also to the situation of the late Roman Republic. That is, how will we integrate these minorities who are already defending on their own way, of course, an untraditional understanding of
this
family,
ultra-liberal
clan,
society
and so on.
is not very good at integrating minorities.
Exactly. Which is very counterintuitive.
It would appear simple, but practice is difficult.
It's the exact contrary.
Yeah. So your thesis is that this the prospect of this new Europe will be more conservative or more right-wing, traditionalist even?
Exactly. For the moment, all the ideals on which the current Europe is based are discrediting themselves. And even the good ideas which were at the basis, as civic participation, democracy, some form of tolerance, etc., also of liberty for minorities, has been pushed to such an extreme by now that it is discrediting its own roots. So that at the end, people will not say, let's return a bit back, but they will say, well, you have seen where democracy has led us, so let's forget about it.
Let's apply this logic to family. For example, we've inherited this tradition of the nuclear family. In the 1960s, with the Cultural Revolution, it becomes very liberal, and now we end up with patchwork families, etc., multiple parent families. That's the other, the antithesis, so to say. So you would say in the future you can imagine a certain return to a form of traditional family life?
I think so, as most people who have been brought up by these form of families are experiencing such an emotional and familiar void within themselves that they are literally wanting to experience something more traditionalist. So it's a question of generation and of, once again, of synthesis or antithesis, that these people will want to found again traditional families and to revert to what the Romans would have called mos maiorum. Of course, it is to be feared that to some degree this will be somewhat artificial. The reform of Augustus was a superficial reform which did not fundamentally change the individualism of the standard Roman.
Yeah, in order to get the picture a bit more clear, your scenario reminded me of this very popular novels by Margaret Atwood. There's a popular Netflix television series called The Handmaid's Tale, and it sketches a scenario in which America becomes all materialistic, the women become infertile, and then there's a certain takeover of power by a kind of conservative evangelicals who install a sort of theocracy. It's a dystopian scenario, but is that the kind of dictatorship that you expect? Because the thing about the series is that the religion is of these sort of evangelical, Republican, right-wingers, it's extremely artificial. It's all outward form and social discipline. But it's not an inner form of religion.
Exactly.
It's instrumentalized for efficiency, control. But the scheme more or less corresponds to your vision of the future European Union.
And corresponds, of course, to what we saw in the late Roman Republic, when Augustus tried to reform the Roman religion, to reform the Roman family, to reform traditions, institutions, and so on. It was a superficial reform, which was animated, of course, by a honest spirit of wanting to put the Republic again on solid traditional historical foundations, but which remained largely superficial. But not so superficial in a pure sense of hypocrisy, but also as using these traditions as a form of expressing one's loyalty to one's own culture. So to speak in today's world, people would not start to go again to the church because they believe, but because they wanted to do a statement to show we are of Christian descent, of Christian culture. We do not necessarily believe as we did in the Middle Age, but we want to show our adherence to some form of society. And that's more or less what happened in Rome with the imperial cult, for example, and that's what I expect also for such a period. One analogy, for example, could be Putin's Russia. There we also see this form of mild dictatorship trying to justify itself through religion, through allusions to history, but still being quite superficial. And
okay, this is one of the last things I want to discuss with you. Is in a sense, there are two time frame, so to say. Much of what you sketch is already realized in Eastern Europe, in the sense of mild dictatorship, maybe the Putin Orban, traditionalism. Is Eastern Europe the future for Western Europe as well?
Yes and no. I would say yes to the sense that we see a greater adherence to tradition, to history, some form of patriotism, and also of love for our common European culture. So that, I think, is certainly a sign of what is to come. But what is paradoxical is that these illiberal democracies, in my view, will prove much more resilient to the threats which are facing the West than what is happening in the West. The West will not survive the threat of economic decline, of Islamization, without radically transforming its democracy. So I see that on the long run, probably the West will revert much more into authoritarian structures, whereas the East, which will not live through these social and ethnic upheavals, may remain more similar to what it has to now, and in the long run be more democratic than what we will become in the West.
Indeed, yes. Okay, so what's my final question would be this prospect for Europe's way into empire. What will it lead to? Will it give way to a new form of culture? Will it rejuvenate European culture, or will it merely enable us to hang on a little longer, maybe a few decades, maybe a century? What's it all about? What's the prospect? What's the hope?
I think there is no real hope. It's certainly, very certainly the second option. That is, Europe will not be rejuvenated. We won't know another Renaissance, for example. We will never revert to the real true spirituality of the Middle Ages, for example. It will be at best some form of agreeable evening, as Mommsen called the Roman Empire. I have to confess that I'm also very strongly influenced by Oswald Spengler and his prediction also, or his parallelization of civilizations, and that is also why I think that this form of post-democratic Europe will resemble to the Roman Empire. That is a period of prolonged stagnation with perhaps some form of economic welfare also, and of civic thriving in some way, but which will not be creative, artistic, cultural anymore.
But your other book is about renovation. Is it in a certain sense a plea for inner renewal? Or is that merely theoretical?
It's not necessarily a true inner renewal. It is rather a way to prevent this extreme form of authoritarian transformation that is to be expected, by already now preventing some of its form by accepting some basic requirements of such a future state. It's a little bit, if you want to compare, like Cicero's endeavor at the end of the Republic to prefigure in some way what Augustus would later do, that is some form of mild, semi-authoritarian republic as the only way to avert the civil crisis. He didn't succeed. Rome knew this form of civil unrest, and then Augustus inspired himself, of course, by Cicero, but put it through in a much more authoritarian way. So our hope is, of course, that our book may be read and understood, but we have not necessarily much hope that it will also be put into reality, but still that it may be a sign, a regulative idea in some way for the future evolutions in order to avert the most dangerous forms of an authoritarian
And what will the
revolution.
difference be for the average citizen? The idea that modernity is a threat to human freedom is as old as modernity itself. Max Weber's idea of the golden cage of bureaucracy and the complexities of modern societies. So I see that, and I think many citizens experience that freedom of expression, for example, is under threat. Democratic freedoms. Will this mild dictatorship be any different for the citizens? Will they be more free or less free?
Yes, there is some form of nostalgia, of course, also in my thinking, which is also why in my other book, Faire, which has also been printed by Blue Tiger Media, I've tried also to speak rather about the individual form of how we will experience this form of transition and how we could in our daily life at least try to conserve as much as possible the old European, the true European way of life through this period of unrest and also through this form of mild dictatorship we will know in the future. I think that for the citizen we can once again look at Rome and see that there, for example, nobody wanted to go back to the Republic. So people really feared this Republic and thought and associated the senatorial regime with corruption, dysfunctioning, etc. So they were quite happy with the empire and they thought that, well, they lost some forms of political participation, but anyway, under the late phases of the senatorial regime, they had no importance anymore. And I think that's what many citizens are feeling today. I will close perhaps with a last opinion poll, which I found very shocking in some way, but very fitting quite well with my prediction. That is, people were asked in many European and Western countries to what degree they thought that democracy was really fundamental to their life. And they were asked in different age classes, and everywhere it was the same evolution, that older people said in the large majority that it was important for them, that democracy was a crucial element of their life, and younger people less. And so I would say, I think in the Netherlands, the number of younger people saying that it is crucial for them to live in a democracy was about 25%, and the same was true for the UK.
For the younger generation, democracy is not a standard aspect of their identity or their values they cherish.
Democracy is already done for.
Yes, they are already over it.
Yeah.
They have already distanced themselves from it in a way.
That's it.
Yeah, that's okay. That's a very challenging thesis. Later on, we will have a short discussion of your geopolitical insights that also make up a large part of the book. For now, I want to thank you for, in the first place, for your very fascinating book. You're a classicist professor, and I know a bit about Latin and Greek language and culture, and it can be boring, but you really brought antiquity to life, and you show in an impressive way the same mechanisms that govern social life in antiquity and in modern Europe, and it's a challenging read, and it gives a lot of food for thought and further discussion. So I want to compliment you with your book, and I wish you all the best. You're a professor in Warsaw. I'm
living in Warsaw. I'm working at Poznan and now at Gorzów Wielkopolski.
So thank you for coming to our studio, and all the best for the future, and thank you very much for
Thank you very much for the interview.
Yes. Tot zover dit interview met professor David Engels over zijn nieuw verschenen boek Op weg naar het imperium, de ondergang van de Romeinse Republiek. Bedankt voor het kijken en graag tot een volgende keer.